never thought one single moment would expose everything I believed about my family. But the second those words left their mouths, I knew my life was about to split into a before and an after. What started as a normal day quietly turned into a betrayal so calculated, so personal that even now I, Samantha, still replay it in my head, wondering how I didn't see it coming. The living room was crowded, my graduation party buzzing with family, friends, and neighbors, laughter filling the air as my mom complimented Samantha's cap and gown while Dad took endless photos. I was smiling for the camera, pretending I was proud, though deep down, I had long suspected the undercurrent of judgment simmering just below their cheerful facades. And then it happened. My cousin, standing beside my sister, leaned toward my parents with a grin, and my mother whispered something that cut sharper than any blade I've ever felt. "You know, maybe this achievement isn't really yours to celebrate. Samantha, you were always more of a mistake than a success." I froze mid-smile, the camera flash blinding me for a fraction of a second, but the humiliation burned through me like acid. My father's chuckle followed, low and approving, like he was watching a private show that I was both the star of and the audience to. Every friend there seemed to fade into the background as Samantha realized in horrifying clarity that the people I had trusted most were publicly tearing me down in a moment meant to honor me. My heart raced, my hands trembling slightly, but I forced myself to smile again for the pictures, swallowing the wave of rage, confusion, and despair that threatened to spill over. That's when it hit me that nothing about this day was ordinary, that all those little slights, the sideways comments, the favors given to my sister and ignored for Samantha, were building toward this precise moment, and the realization made my stomach churn. I had been groomed to believe in their approval while they systematically undermined me behind the scenes, and now the facade had crumbled, leaving Samantha exposed, but also strangely alive, as if the humiliation had unlocked something inside me I didn't know was there. The room seemed to shrink around Samantha, every laugh and whisper a dagger, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, to nod, to act like I belonged, all while my mind began spinning, tracing back every subtle manipulation, every betrayal disguised as parental concern, every time I had been cast as the lesser child, the invisible one, the daughter who wasn't enough. I remembered the birthday when they gave my sister the expensive bicycle I had been begging for, while they told Samantha to make do with the hand-me-downs. I remembered the family dinners where my ideas were interrupted, minimized, or mocked, while my sister's every word was praised. And now, the humiliation had been elevated to a public spectacle in front of people I trusted to celebrate Samantha's life's milestones with me. Yet, amid the overwhelming shame and anger, a strange clarity began to emerge. I understood in that instant that Samantha was no longer a child waiting for validation. I was a person who had been wronged for far too long, and the next time they tried to break me in front of others, I wouldn't just stand there. Something had shifted, almost imperceptibly but irrevocably. That morning had begun as a quiet routine, but by midday, the carefully constructed illusion of family support had been shattered, leaving Samantha alone with a decision I hadn't yet realized I was capable of making: to endure, to fight, or to completely reclaim control of a life that had been underestimated, dismissed, and mocked for far too long. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to the channel. These stories dive deep into real family drama, hidden betrayals, and emotional twists. And if you enjoy stories that keep you hooked till the very end, you won't want to miss what's coming next. That morning felt ordinary enough. Samantha woke up thinking it would be just another routine day, unaware that the people I trusted most were already setting things in motion behind my back. Even as I walked through the familiar hallways of my apartment, preparing breakfast and mentally reviewing the notes I needed for my day, the air felt heavier than usual. Something intangible lingered, like the faint trace of smoke before a fire breaks out. I shrugged it off, blaming stress or exhaustion, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that today would mark the start of a chain of events I could neither predict nor control. My parents, who had always insisted on checking in regularly, arrived unexpectedly, citing a concern for Samantha's safety, but the way they looked at me, scanning my apartment as if it belonged to someone else, made my skin crawl. My sister, texting from her own room, hinted at what she had learned, though I wasn't sure yet what she meant. Everything was calculated, the smiles, the questions, the casual remarks that were actually traps. And yet I smiled, nodded, and acted oblivious, knowing that losing control now would play directly into their hands. Every sip of coffee, every glance at the window, Every carefully choreographed movement became part of a silent dance I hadn't realized I was rehearsing. By the time they left, claiming they had to run errands, I felt simultaneously relieved and more determined than ever to reclaim not just my space, but my dignity. This moment, humiliating, sharp, and unexpected, had lit a fire within Samantha, one that I knew I had to feed carefully if I wanted to turn the situation to my favor. Growing up, Samantha had always sensed the invisible line her parents drew between her and her sister, though she never had the words to describe it. From as early as she could remember, her achievements were met with polite nods or quick compliments, while her sister was showered with praise, gifts, and opportunities that Samantha was subtly denied. Birthdays were the clearest example. While Samantha received practical, often second-hand presents, her sister was lavished with the latest toys, electronics, or clothes that screamed importance. Even in school, when Samantha brought home A+ report cards, her accomplishments were acknowledged with a brief "good job," before the conversation quickly shifted to her sister's latest accomplishments, as if Samantha's achievements were merely background noise in the symphony of her family's life. Family dinners were worse. Samantha's suggestions, opinions, and even her jokes were often met with interruptions, sighs, or dismissive laughter. Her sister, on the other hand, commanded attention effortlessly, and her every comment was dissected, discussed, and praised. Samantha had grown up learning to minimize her own voice, to quietly perform and achieve without expectation of recognition, internalizing a belief that she was invisible or worse, expendable. This neglect wasn't just emotional. It was financial and social. College applications were a nightmare of subtle sabotage. Her parents questioned her choices, minimized her ambitions, and often used financial excuses to restrict her options, while her sister had the latest tutors, the best prep courses, and trips that boosted her college profile effortlessly. Samantha learned to adapt, to become cautious, strategic, and patient, developing a quiet resilience that no one seemed to notice. She realized over time that anger, while natural, was dangerous in her family context. It was dismissed, punished, or twisted against her. So she internalized it, channeling her energy into careful observation, noticing patterns, tracking behaviors, and quietly preparing for a time when she could act decisively. The first taste of public humiliation came at a seemingly innocent family gathering when Samantha, aged 16, presented a science project she had worked on for months. As she proudly explained her research, her sister whispered something to her parents, and they exchanged barely concealed smirks. When Samantha turned back to the group, her project was dismissed as good for a school project, while her sister's latest art competition win was the topic of conversation for the rest of the evening. Samantha had cried silently in her room that night, but she also began something she had never done before. She took meticulous notes. She noted which relatives sided with whom, how comments were phrased, what gestures indicated approval or disdain, and most importantly, when her parents were manipulating the narrative to favor her sister. Over the years, Samantha became a master observer, masking her feelings with politeness, humor, or silence, while building an internal map of power dynamics she could exploit later. This wasn't bitterness or revenge yet. It was survival. And as she transitioned into adulthood, Samantha began to find moments of independence that her parents either ignored or grudgingly allowed, assuming she would fail. She took small steps, opening a bank account in her name, applying for jobs she knew her parents wouldn't support, moving into her own apartment despite subtle warnings. Each action a calculated assertion of control. She learned to hide her plans, to smile at their criticism while secretly strengthening her position. By the time she had graduated, Samantha wasn't just the invisible daughter anymore. She was someone quietly amassing the tools she would need to reclaim respect and agency over her own life. That graduation party, which had been intended as a showcase of Samantha's vulnerability, only confirmed to her how deeply she had been underestimated. Every laugh, every whisper, every glance from her parents was now data, confirming what she had suspected for years. They assumed she was powerless, that she would continue to absorb humiliation and comply. But Samantha had grown wise in the art of patience. While her parents focused on appearances, she had been building independence, gathering documents, securing her own finances, and mapping out every avenue to assert control. And she knew the moment would come when their underestimation would become their undoing. She remembered small moments that had seemed inconsequential at the time, overheard phone calls about inheritance, subtle bragging about her sister's latest achievements, even the way they mocked her future prospects, and filed each one away in her mind. Samantha wasn't just preparing for revenge in the dramatic sense. She was preparing for justice, for a recalibration of power that her parents had long refused to recognize. Every slight, every insult, every instance of favoritism had been a lesson, and Samantha had been paying attention. The emotional pain had forged patience, observation, and strategy. She had become quiet, calculating, but never cruel, understanding that true power lay in timing, in knowledge, and in the ability to act with precision while appearing powerless. This part of Samantha's life, invisible to everyone else, would later become the cornerstone of her victory. The humiliation she endured, the dismissals and inequities, were the fuel that allowed her to plan meticulously, to move when the time was right, and to reclaim dignity in a way that her family could neither anticipate nor counter. She had been the overlooked, underestimated daughter for years, but those years had quietly built her into someone formidable, capable of transforming their underestimation into her ultimate advantage. By the time Samantha moved into her own apartment, she thought the hardest part of breaking free from her parents' control was over. But freedom, as she quickly learned, came with its own battlefield. Her parents had never truly respected boundaries. What they called checking in was really an excuse to monitor, manipulate, and assert dominance. At first, it was subtle. Phone calls that started with concern ended with veiled accusations or guilt trips. Are you sure you're eating properly? Or do you really need to spend money on that? Samantha answered politely, concealing the irritation that flared each time they reminded her she owed them respect simply for being born into their household. Then came the unannounced visits. At first, a knock on the door in the middle of the day seemed innocent. Her parents would smile, act cheerful, and stroll in without waiting for permission, as if her apartment wasn't her own. Samantha would force herself to laugh, offer coffee, small talk, pretending that it was normal for her private life to be invaded, while mentally taking note of every detail, which drawers they opened, what questions they asked, what they seemed interested in, and most importantly, how far she could push them before they reacted. She realized quickly that direct confrontation only gave them satisfaction. They interpreted pushback as defiance. So Samantha adopted a different strategy: quiet observation and preparation. She reinforced locks, changed routines, and installed subtle security measures without their knowledge. She began keeping meticulous records of every intrusion, every veiled criticism, and every attempt to manipulate her, all filed neatly in a mental archive that would become invaluable later. Even her friends noticed her tension. Samantha avoided discussing her family in detail, choosing instead to maintain the illusion that her life was calm, that she was unaffected by their interference. Yet, behind closed doors, she was quietly asserting control. She started paying her own bills, managing her own finances, and organizing her apartment in ways that gave her complete independence. Every purchase, every decision, every small action reinforced her autonomy, the one thing her parents constantly sought to undermine. The more they tried to control her, the more Samantha grew confident in her ability to manage, to anticipate, and to plan. She even began leaving small traps for them, not in a malicious sense but to gauge their reactions. A subtly rearranged living room, bills in plain sight that they assumed she hadn't paid, minor contradictions in her schedule, all carefully observed for how her parents would respond. The pattern was always the same: intrusion, judgment, withdrawal. But each time they overstepped, Samantha gained more insight into their behavior. One night, Samantha returned from work to find her father sitting on her sofa, going through a stack of papers she had left on the coffee table. Her heart raced, but she calmly asked, "Do you need something, Dad?" His smile faltered for a moment. He realized she was aware, that she hadn't reacted with panic or anger, and that she controlled the narrative now. Samantha had learned to respond with composed authority rather than emotional outbursts. Over time, she noticed that even her sister became a participant in the intrusions, often siding with their parents in subtle ways, whether by sending messages to warn them about Samantha's choices, or by reporting minor infractions. Every act of interference, however frustrating, became a data point for Samantha's long-term plan. The emotional toll was real: nights spent lying awake, imagining the humiliation of public confrontation, wondering if her efforts to remain calm were enough. But the resilience she built during these years gave her an unshakable core. It was during this period that Samantha's strategy began to crystallize. She would not react immediately, she would not confront rashly, and she would never let her parents perceive the strength she had cultivated. Instead, she would appear powerless while meticulously preparing for the day when their overconfidence would become their downfall. She began documenting financial discrepancies, noting patterns of favoritism, and quietly preparing legal avenues that could enforce her independence without appearing vindictive. Each intrusion, each violation, each attempt to control her became a stepping stone toward a larger payoff she knew was coming. By the time the moment arrived, Samantha would have all the evidence, all the leverage, and all the composure necessary to assert her autonomy in a way that her parents could neither ignore nor reverse. She practiced patience, knowing that the public spectacle of humiliation they had orchestrated at her graduation was only a prelude. The real victory, Samantha realized, would be quiet, precise, and undeniable. A reversal of power so complete that her family would finally understand the consequences of underestimating her. And every time her parents knocked on her door unannounced, tried to manipulate her finances, or subtly undermined her achievements, Samantha smiled inwardly, because she knew the day of reckoning was approaching, and when it came it would be nothing like their expectations. It would be measured, deliberate, and inescapably conclusive. Over the months, Samantha's careful planning began to coalesce into a tangible strategy. Every intrusion, every comment, every subtle attempt to manipulate her had been catalogued and analyzed. She had quietly secured her own finances, set up independent accounts, and even documented evidence of her parents' attempts to control her life, from unauthorized entries into her apartment to financial coercion disguised as concern. At first, it felt like a private victory, a sense of calm knowing she was no longer entirely at their mercy. But Samantha knew that the real challenge would come when she finally faced them publicly, when the carefully constructed illusions her parents had built over decades collided with the reality of her independence. She spent countless nights rehearsing scenarios in her mind, imagining the conversations, the possible denials, the inevitable attempts at gaslighting. She visualized remaining composed, her voice steady, her expressions controlled, while her parents struggled to maintain authority they no longer possessed. The more she prepared, the more Samantha realized how much power had been hiding in plain sight. Her parents' assumption that she would always comply, their belief that she was weak and malleable, and their overconfidence in their own superiority. She began to feel a quiet thrill at the thought of finally demonstrating, in a calm and undeniable way, that she had outgrown their control. Even small steps became part of the preparation. Samantha invited a few trusted friends to casual gatherings at her apartment, letting her parents drop by unexpectedly to test their reactions. Each intrusion was handled with polite composure, subtly exposing their overstepping and reminding Samantha of the data she had gathered. She also researched legal and logistical measures, understanding that the combination of emotional intelligence and concrete evidence would make her eventual assertion of autonomy unassailable. The emotional pressure, however, was far from over. Her sister continued to be a complicating factor, often acting as a mouthpiece for their parents' criticism, undermining Samantha in ways that felt personal and cruel. Each interaction required careful navigation. She couldn't let anger dictate her responses, yet she also couldn't appear weak. Samantha learned to turn every slight into insight, every condescending comment into fuel for the coming confrontation. One evening, during a family dinner that Samantha had been coerced into attending, she observed every gesture, every word, every glance. Her parents' smug satisfaction at having orchestrated what they thought was a subtle humiliation now seemed almost comical to Samantha, because she knew she had already anticipated the outcome of every possible scenario. She left the dinner with a quiet sense of triumph, her exterior calm hiding the storm of preparation and patience that had been building for years. Each victory was invisible to them, but internally, Samantha felt the growing momentum of her plan. Finally, the day arrived when all her careful work would meet its first public test. Her parents, unaware of the depth of her preparation, continued to treat her with the same condescension they had for decades. They assumed that a minor financial request or a casual suggestion could still unsettle her, that their intrusion would yield the same compliant responses as before. Samantha, however, had meticulously arranged everything: documentation, witnesses, and a plan to assert her independence without confrontation, relying solely on evidence, calm authority, and moral clarity. She entered the situation with a composed exterior, aware that the tension would peak when her parents realized that their assumptions were flawed. Every subtle action she had taken, from installing security measures to managing her finances independently, now contributed to a quiet but undeniable shift in power. Even the most trivial intrusions previously tolerated had been transformed into tools she could use to assert control publicly. As the family gathered for a minor event, a brunch that her parents had expected her to attend reluctantly, Samantha could feel the undercurrent of condescension, the subtle glares and whispered critiques. But this time she was ready. Each prepared document, each carefully logged instance of manipulation, and each quiet boundary she had enforced would now converge into a moment that her parents could neither ignore nor deflect. The emotional tension was almost unbearable, yet Samantha held her composure, knowing that the payoff was imminent. Every misstep her parents had made, every assumption about her weakness, had been meticulously recorded and analyzed. And now, standing on the precipice of what would be her ultimate assertion of autonomy, Samantha felt a sense of calm that was both exhilarating and terrifying, because the humiliation they had inflicted for so long was about to be reversed in a way that would be undeniable, controlled, and morally unassailable. The stage was set for the first public reversal of power, and Samantha's years of quiet preparation were about to pay off in a way that her family had never imagined. The day Samantha had been preparing for years finally arrived, and the tension was almost tangible. Her parents, still confident in their assumed superiority, had invited her to a family gathering under the pretense of celebrating a minor achievement of her sister's. They expected the same compliance, the same timid acceptance of their authority, the same polite nods and forced smiles that Samantha had been giving them for years. What they didn't know was that Samantha had transformed her humiliation into strategy, her patience into power, and her quiet endurance into undeniable control. She arrived at the gathering poised, calm, and unassuming, letting her parents believe that they still held the upper hand. But every subtle movement, every carefully prepared piece of evidence she carried in her mind, every arrangement she had made for witnesses and documentation, was part of a master plan that would leave them speechless. As the brunch began, her parents slipped into their usual pattern of veiled critiques, whispered comparisons, and subtle jabs aimed at undermining her. Samantha listened carefully, acknowledging each statement politely, never betraying the slightest hint of anger or panic. Then, when the moment was right, she calmly presented her case. First, she revealed the documented evidence of financial coercion and repeated intrusions into her apartment, carefully logged, precisely dated, and undeniable. She showed how her independence had been systematically obstructed, how favoritism had been given to her sister at her expense, and how countless attempts had been made to manipulate, belittle, and control her life. Her parents' expressions shifted rapidly from smug satisfaction to stunned disbelief. They tried to interrupt, to deflect, to downplay the evidence, but Samantha remained composed, her voice steady, her demeanor controlled. Each denial was met with further proof, each attempt at gaslighting countered with calm authority. Her sister, who had long enjoyed the role of co-conspirator, looked helpless as Samantha dismantled the narrative that had been carefully constructed to undermine her. What had once been a room of judgment and mockery now transformed into a space where Samantha's quiet, calculated strength dominated. The room was silent, save for her composed voice, as her parents realized too late that they had underestimated her entirely. The humiliation that had been inflicted on her for years was now mirrored back, not through aggression or confrontation, but through the undeniable clarity of truth, strategy, and moral authority. Samantha had won without raising her voice, without resorting to anger or revenge. The reversal was public, undeniable, and devastating in its precision. Her parents, confronted with the consequences of their actions in a way they could neither argue against nor dismiss, were left speechless, forced to reckon with the years of favoritism, neglect, and manipulation that they had inflicted. Samantha's quiet preparation, her patience, and her composure had culminated in a victory that was not only strategic but emotionally validating. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time in her life, Samantha felt complete control over her own narrative, her dignity restored in full view of the people who had long sought to undermine her. The calm authority she displayed left no room for debate. The evidence, the preparation, and the timing ensured that her triumph was absolute. For the first time, she could experience not just relief, but a profound sense of justice, knowing that the years of endurance, observation, and careful strategy had paid off in a way that was both morally unassailable and emotionally satisfying. After that gathering, Samantha felt an overwhelming sense of relief and quiet triumph. For the first time, the weight of years spent navigating favoritism, manipulation, and public humiliation had lifted, replaced by the calm certainty that she had finally reclaimed her life. Her parents, once figures of authority and control, now appeared fragile and uncertain, their assumptions shattered in the presence of undeniable truth. Samantha realized that she no longer needed their approval or validation. The power she had painstakingly built over the years was hers alone, unassailable and quietly commanding respect. The subtle smile she allowed herself as she left the gathering wasn't just a reaction to their stunned silence. It was a reflection of the inner peace she had earned, a recognition that patience, careful planning, and moral authority could overturn even decades of oppression and favoritism. In the days that followed, Samantha continued to maintain boundaries with her family, calmly asserting her independence while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. She moved forward with her life fully aware that she no longer needed to defend herself emotionally. Her dignity, once compromised, had been restored in full view of those who had doubted her. Friends and colleagues noticed a change as well. There was a newfound confidence in her voice, an unshakable composure in her presence, and a quiet authority in her demeanor. Samantha no longer felt like the overlooked daughter. She felt like a woman who had endured, observed, and acted with precision, earning a respect that had previously been withheld. Even her sister, who had long been the recipient of favoritism, seemed to regard Samantha differently, as if recognizing for the first time that the underestimated sibling had quietly outmaneuvered years of manipulation. Samantha's life, once defined by constraint and humiliation, now unfolded with clarity and purpose. She had learned that emotional pain, when met with strategic patience and calm resilience, could be transformed into power, autonomy, and moral vindication. The journey had been long, exhausting, and emotionally taxing, but the outcome was undeniable. Samantha had turned the tables without anger, without impulsive confrontation, and without compromising her integrity. In the end, she stood firmly in her own life, fully independent, respected, and empowered, leaving behind a family who finally understood, far too late, that underestimating her had been their greatest mistake. Samantha walked away from the shadow of their favoritism and control, carrying with her not just the relief of victory, but the quiet satisfaction of having claimed her life on her own terms, proving that dignity, strategy, and patience could outlast even the deepest familial betrayals.